What if I told you that what I'm about to share with you is not just a story, but a real experience, one so terrifying that it'll make you second-guess what you believe to be true? Imagine a night where the line between reality and nightmare blurs, where something you can't explain is happening right in front of your eyes, and you're powerless to stop it. This is the terrifying story of a night that will haunt you long after the screen goes dark. Picture this, a secluded cabin, a quiet retreat, far from the chaos of the world. But as the night deepens, something sinister begins to stir. You'll hear footsteps in the silence, feel a cold breath on your neck, and witness a horror no one should ever see. This is not fiction. It's a chilling tale from someone who lived through it, someone who had the courage to share their experience, and now it's time for you to hear it. But before we plunge into the depths of terror, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to Sinister Stories, and share this with anyone you know who has a taste for the unexplainable. Trust me, you'll want them to hear this. You won't believe it until you hear it, and even then, you might wish you hadn't. This opening needs to captivate the viewer, immediately pulling them into the mystery and dread of what's to come. You want them to feel intrigued but also slightly uncomfortable, as if they are about to witness something unsettling and beyond their understanding. The horror should feel imminent, creeping toward them as they continue to watch. The cabin stood alone at the edge of a dense forest, nestled in the heart of nowhere, miles from civilization. The kind of place people only visit when they crave isolation, peace, and quiet. But as night fell, that peacefulness turned into an oppressive silence, a silence that felt wrong, unnatural. The wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't a soothing sound. It was a mournful wail, as though the forest itself was crying out in agony. The wooden structure of the cabin creaked and groaned, as though it too were alive, fighting against the weight of time and neglect. The walls, worn and weathered by years of exposure, seemed to breathe in the cold night air. The thin curtains fluttered by the window, their movement too slow, too deliberate, as if something was pushing them from the other side. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp wood and something else, something metallic, almost like rust, lingering in the corners of the room. Outside, the trees towered over the cabin, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky like dark fingers, swaying in rhythm with the eerie wind. The dense thicket of the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, swallowing up any hint of light from the moon. The clearing around the cabin was small, like the world itself had decided to keep its distance. As the last slivers of daylight disappeared, the cabin seemed to sink deeper into the shadows, becoming one with the darkness that surrounded it. There was something unnerving about the place, something that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The silence was too complete, too profound, as if the world beyond the cabin had vanished entirely. No birds, no rustling animals, not even the sound of crickets to break the stillness. It felt as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something that should not be. The night had come alive with whispers, and in the darkness beyond the cabin's walls, it was clear that whatever lingered out there, it wasn't human. At first, it was subtle, so subtle that it could have easily been dismissed, written off as the product of an overactive imagination, or the natural creaks and groans of an old cabin settling into the night. But Mark knew better. He had been in enough old houses to recognize that the silence here was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a remote getaway. It was a dead, suffocating kind of silence. The kind that weighed on your chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. The kind that gnawed at you, slowly unraveling your sanity, until you were no longer sure if you were truly alone. It started with the sound of footsteps. Soft, hesitant, as though someone or something was walking on the wooden porch. The steps weren't heavy, nor were they erratic. They were too measured, too deliberate. Mark froze, staring at the door as if he expected it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened. The footsteps stopped. He couldn't even tell if they had come from outside or within the cabin itself. Perhaps the wind had carried the sound from the forest, or it was just the house playing tricks on his mind. He tried to shake it off, tried to convince himself that it was nothing. But then the temperature in the room dropped, and it wasn't a gentle drop. It was abrupt, a sudden chill that made his breath visible in the dim light of the cabin. He shivered, his fingers numb as he reached for the fireplace. But the fire was still roaring, too hot, almost unnaturally so. His mind raced, searching for an explanation. Could it be a draft? Maybe the old windows had gaps he hadn't noticed. But deep down, he knew it wasn't the windows. The cold wasn't natural. It didn't belong here. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, just a murmur at the edge of his hearing, like a voice calling out from a far-off room. He stood still, straining to catch the words, but there were none. Just an unsettling, low hum, as though someone, or something, was speaking to him from the other side of the wall. His heart began to beat faster, the anxiety rising in his chest like a heavy hand. Was he imagining it? Or was the cabin itself trying to communicate something to him? The whispers grew louder, closer, almost as if they were inside the room with him now. He turned his head slowly, scanning the dim corners of the cabin, but saw nothing. Yet the sound was unmistakable. It was in the air, thick with a presence that seemed to curl around him like a cold, invisible fog. His throat tightened as he realized that the source of the whispers wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. The chill in the room intensified, and Mark felt an overwhelming pressure in his chest, as though the very air itself was trying to squeeze the life out of him. And then, as if on cue, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then a third time before plunging the cabin into complete darkness. The hum of the whispers faded, leaving behind an eerie silence that was somehow worse. He was alone, but it no longer felt like he was. The suffocating quiet was too much to bear, and Mark felt the distinct sensation that something unseen, something unnatural, was watching him. Waiting. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer, stretching toward him like claws, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was not just observing him. It was planning something horrible. As he stood there, paralyzed in the dark, Mark realized that he wasn't just hearing things. He wasn't just imagining the cold, the footsteps, the whispers. It was real, and it was getting closer. Mark's mind raced as he stood in the oppressive silence of the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold had settled in deeper, and now it wasn't just the temperature that was freezing him to the spot. It was the fear. The unmistakable fear that gripped his soul and made every inch of him scream to run, to escape, to get as far away from this cursed place as possible. But his feet refused to move. His body, though trembling with terror, remained rooted to the spot, as if some unseen force was holding him in place. He had never felt this way before, completely paralyzed by something he couldn't see, something he couldn't understand. It was a feeling that clawed at his insides, digging its way into his very being. He wanted to leave, wanted to break free from this suffocating dread, but the longer he stood there, the more the cabin seemed to close in around him. His thoughts swirled in a dizzying spiral. There was nowhere to run, no one around to help. He had to face whatever was out there, whatever was causing this nightmare, or he would be trapped in this hell forever. But the fear was suffocating. His breath hitched in his throat, and a cold sweat dripped down his spine. Every rational part of him screamed to leave, but his curiosity, the need to understand, to know, pushed him forward. What was it that had been haunting him? The sounds, the cold, the whispers, they were too real to ignore. It wasn't just a bad dream. It wasn't his mind playing tricks on him. Something had been moving in that dark corner of the cabin, something that wasn't bound by the laws of reality. The rational part of his brain urged him to leave, to forget about it, to run far away and never look back. But another, darker part of him, a part that he couldn't explain, felt drawn to the unknown. It was almost as if he were being called by something, beckoned by a presence that whispered promises of answers, of truth. His pulse quickened, the tension building in his chest as he turned slowly toward the door. He knew what was waiting outside. He had heard it. He had felt it. But still, he couldn't bring himself to move. He stood there in the dark, staring at the door as if he could will it open with his mind. The silence pressed in around him again, thick and suffocating, and he felt a chill crawl up his spine. Every instinct told him to stay where he was, to remain hidden, safe in the shadows. But that nagging curiosity, that drive to uncover the truth, fought against the paralyzing fear. Mark's hands shook as he reached for the door handle. He couldn't stop himself, couldn't deny the overwhelming need to know what lay beyond the cabin's walls. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he twisted the handle. It creaked in protest, as if the very wood of the door was trying to hold him back. But he didn't stop. He had to know. He had to face whatever was waiting for him. As he stepped outside, the cold air hit him like a slap to the face, and the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. The wind howled through the trees, but there was no comfort in its sound. It wasn't a natural wind. It was wild, untamed, almost feral. The trees groaned and shifted, their branches bending and swaying as if they were alive, as if they were watching him. Mark squinted into the blackness, trying to make out anything in the pitch-black night, but there was nothing. Just endless shadows. His heart raced as he took a tentative step forward, each footfall heavy with dread. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though something was watching him from every corner of the forest, from every darkened nook of the cabin. His breath caught in his throat as he moved further into the clearing, the darkness seeming to close in tighter with each passing second. His mind screamed for him to turn back, to run, to get away from whatever this place had become. But the part of him that couldn't look away, the part of him that had to know, refused to let him stop. The decision was made. There was no going back. Whatever was out there, whatever was haunting this place, would have to face him now. And with that thought, the tension in the air seemed to tighten even more, pressing in from all sides. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. And he was about to discover exactly what had been lurking in the shadows. As Mark stepped further into the clearing, the darkness seemed to thicken, as if it were alive, pressing in on him from all sides. His breath was shallow, his pulse racing in his ears. The cold was unbearable now, crawling under his skin, making his bones ache. Every step he took felt like an eternity, as if the very earth beneath him was unwilling to let him go. The night around him seemed to come alive with the sound of the wind, but it was more than just the wind. It was as if the trees themselves were whispering, urging him to stop, to turn around, to forget whatever madness had possessed him. But he couldn't stop. He had come this far, and now there was no turning back. A low hum filled the air, like a vibration that he could feel deep in his chest. It was a sound unlike anything he had ever heard before, neither human nor animal, but something otherworldly, something wrong. His eyes darted around, searching for the source, but the darkness seemed endless. Then, through the inky blackness, he saw it, movement. At first, it was a shadow, barely perceptible, a figure flickering at the edge of his vision. Mark blinked, trying to focus, but when his eyes cleared, it was still there, standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its form was indistinct, like a silhouette blurred by some terrible force. It wasn't solid. It was like smoke, twisting and swirling, yet it stood perfectly still, its presence somehow more oppressive than the physical weight of the air around him. Mark froze, his heart pounding so loudly that he could hear nothing else. The creature, if that's what it was, seemed to be watching him, its shape shifting and undulating with the night breeze. His throat tightened, his body rigid with terror. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to obey. The figure seemed to beckon him, as if it knew his fear, knew the terror it inspired and fed on it. Then, without warning, it moved. The figure glided toward him, its movements jerky yet impossibly smooth, as if it were floating just above the ground. Mark could feel the air grow heavier, the darkness closing in around him like a tightening grip. His breath caught in his throat as the figure came closer, until it was no more than a few feet away. He could feel its presence, feel the weight of its gaze, even though he couldn't see its eyes. There was no face, no features, just an inky void where its head should have been. The silence was broken only by the faint, eerie hum that surrounded him. And then it spoke. The voice was not a voice at all. It was a whisper, but one that didn't come from the air. It came from inside his mind. Mark could feel the words, not in his ears, but in his skull, as if the very marrow of his bones were vibrating in response. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice hissed, sending a chill down his spine. It wasn't a warning, it was a statement, final, unyielding, and deeply unsettling. He wanted to scream, to run, but he was frozen, trapped by the voice that pulsed inside him, echoing in the hollow spaces of his mind. "You've already seen too much. There is no turning back now." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. His body trembled, and his thoughts became fragmented, shattered by the force of the supernatural presence before him. The figure leaned closer, the air around him growing colder, colder than it had ever been before. The temperature dropped so quickly that Mark could see his breath, thick and misty in the freezing air. But it wasn't just the cold that gnawed at him. It was the overwhelming sense that something terrible was coming, something that would swallow him whole if he didn't act fast. Before he could move, the figure lunged. It wasn't a leap in the traditional sense. It was more like the creature folded itself into the air, moving faster than the eye could follow, and suddenly, it was right there in front of him, its tendrils reaching out from the darkness. Mark's heart exploded in his chest, a primal scream rising from deep within him, but it was cut off before it could leave his throat. The creature's presence was suffocating, closing in on him like a shroud of death. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Mark staggered backward, his heart racing, his mind reeling from the shock. The air around him returned to its normal, oppressive stillness. The creature, whatever it was, had vanished. But the feeling of its presence lingered, thick and suffocating, like a dark cloud hanging over him. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse, and he could feel his legs shaking as the adrenaline left his body. He had barely been able to comprehend what had just happened before the darkness around him seemed to breathe in, taking him with it. He was no longer alone. He never had been. The shadows were alive, and they were hungry. Mark stood there, trembling in the eerie silence, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His mind raced, unable to grasp the full extent of the horror he had just encountered. His breath came in shallow, rapid bursts as he staggered backward, his eyes darting around the clearing, searching for any sign of the creature that had just vanished into thin air. But the darkness remained still, oppressive, as if it were waiting for him to make the next move. And then he heard it, the faintest sound, a whisper carried on the wind. It was a voice, but not one he could hear with his ears. It was in his head, deep and low, vibrating in his skull like a slow, creeping tremor. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice murmured again, cold and detached. The same words, but now they felt more like a command than a warning. As if the forest itself had turned against him, as if the earth were telling him he had made a grave mistake by stepping into its domain. Mark's pulse hammered in his ears, and for a moment, he felt like he was losing his grip on reality. The lines between the physical world and the supernatural blurred, and the forest seemed to close in around him, the trees now looming taller, their twisted branches stretching toward him like skeletal fingers. The air grew thick, choking him, as if the atmosphere itself had turned hostile. His vision flickered in and out, like a broken film reel, distorting the scene before him. And then the shadows shifted. From the corner of his eye, he saw them, shapes moving through the trees, not human, not animal, but something in between. They were tall and distorted, their forms barely visible, blending into the darkness like specters. But as they approached, their outlines became clearer. Their limbs were elongated, too long, and their movements were jerky, unnatural. They didn't walk, they glided, their feet barely touching the ground. There was no sound, no breath, no life in them, just hollow, empty forms that drifted silently toward him. Mark's heart froze in his chest. He tried to move, to run, but his legs refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, his body locked in place by an unseen force. The creatures came closer, their blank faces staring at him with eyes that weren't eyes, just empty, soulless voids. They surrounded him, and for the first time, Mark understood the terrible truth. This was never just a haunted cabin or a random encounter with the supernatural. This was their world, the world of the lost, the world of the forgotten. And he was intruding on it. He had awakened something that should have stayed buried, something that had been waiting in the shadows for a long, long time. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and Mark stumbled, his feet slipping as if the earth itself were trying to swallow him whole. His hands shot out to steady himself, but instead of solid ground, he felt the cold, slick surface of something alive, something writhing beneath the soil. His fingers dug into the dirt as he tried to pull himself free, but the more he struggled, the deeper he sank into the earth. The whispers grew louder, the air heavier, as if the very forest was alive with a malevolent presence. "You shouldn't have come," the voice echoed again, this time all around him, coming from the trees, from the wind, from the very earth beneath him. Mark's vision blurred as the creatures closed in, their eerie, disembodied voices growing louder, their hollow eyes gleaming in the darkness. And then it hit him, the revelation. The chilling truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. This was no ordinary cabin. This was no ordinary forest. It was a place of convergence, a place where the living and the dead, the real and the imagined collided. A place where the souls of the lost were trapped forever, and where the creatures of the shadows fed on the fear of those who stumbled too close. Mark had unknowingly crossed into their domain, and now he would never leave. As the darkness closed in, Mark's scream was swallowed by the wind, his voice lost in the abyss. The forest had claimed him, and there was no escape. The darkness swallowed Mark whole. His body jerked violently, his limbs no longer his own, as if the shadows themselves were taking control. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. His mouth was dry, his mind a storm of fear and confusion. The creatures, the whispers, the suffocating presence of the forest, it all overwhelmed him, dragging him deeper into its endless, hollow void. As the cold earth seemed to pull him further into its depths, Mark's vision blurred, the edges of his sight turning black, and for a moment, he thought he might lose consciousness. But just as suddenly as the pull began, it stopped. Everything went still. A haunting silence descended upon him, one that was far worse than the noise of his fear. The creatures were gone. The whispers, too, had ceased, leaving nothing but an empty, suffocating quiet that felt like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The air around him felt thick, as if something unseen was pressing in on him, testing his very existence. Mark slowly opened his eyes, his breath shallow and uneven. His body felt heavy, like it no longer belonged to him. The forest around him seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, the trees now still, their once twisting branches now bent toward the ground, their forms distorted and unnatural. The cold wasn't gone, but it had settled deep within him, an icy presence he couldn't shake. The nightmare that had once consumed him now felt like an insidious part of him, lodged in his chest, squeezing the air out of his lungs. He looked around, his body stiff, his mind disjointed. The clearing where the cabin had stood was gone. In its place was nothing but a desolate expanse of twisted trees, the dark sky above stretching out forever. There was no sign of the cabin, no sign of any safe place to return to. It was as if the forest had erased all traces of his time there, swallowed it up in one swift motion. He had no idea how long he'd been there, or how much time had passed. The world around him felt unreal, a nightmare that had bled into his waking reality. Mark stumbled to his feet, his head spinning. His legs were weak, trembling beneath him, but he pushed forward, his every instinct telling him to get out, to escape whatever had just taken place. But as he took each step, the earth beneath him seemed to shift, as if it were pulling him back, trying to drag him into the soil once more. His heart raced in his chest, and his breath quickened, panic rising in his throat. He couldn't run, couldn't escape. The forest had him. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he saw something, movement. A shadow darted between the trees. He whipped his head around, eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there. Just the flicker of something gone before he could focus. He wasn't alone. He never had been. The realization hit him with the full force of the terror he'd felt earlier. There was no leaving. The forest, the creatures, the shadows, it was all part of the same cursed place, and it had claimed him. Mark's body shook violently as a sense of hopelessness overwhelmed him. He tried to scream, but the words were caught in his throat. His eyes darted wildly, searching for any sign of life, any sign of escape, but all he could see were the twisted trees and the endless expanse of darkness closing in. The air thickened again, colder this time, as if the very essence of the forest was seeping into his bones. And then there was a whisper, soft, chilling, like the wind brushing past his ear. It was the same voice, the one that had haunted him since the beginning. "You shouldn't have come." The whisper echoed through the trees, resonating deep within him, a final confirmation of the truth he could no longer deny. He wasn't just trapped in the forest. He was trapped in a place where the boundaries between life and death had been erased, a place where the lost wandered forever, trapped by their own fear and regret. Mark had become one of them. There was no escape. There was no way out. As the darkness closed in around him, Mark's last thoughts were consumed by one horrible, undeniable truth. He had become part of the forest, part of its endless, twisted nightmare. And the terror would never stop. It would never let him go. The forest had claimed him, and it would keep him there for eternity. Days, maybe weeks, passed before Mark finally stumbled out of the forest, though he didn't know how. He couldn't remember how he made it back to the cabin, or how much time had truly passed. His mind was clouded, fractured, as if it couldn't hold on to the reality he had once known. The world around him seemed foreign now, as though he had stepped out of one nightmare and into another. The trees that had once seemed so distant now seemed to reach toward him, their branches stretching like fingers, grasping for him, as if they were alive. The cold, always the cold, clung to his skin like a second layer, chilling him to the bone. He tried to return to the life he once knew, to the world that existed before he stepped into that cursed place. But everything was different. His friends avoided his eyes, unsure of what to say, unsure of what he had seen. They tried to comfort him, but Mark felt nothing but the weight of the shadows that still clung to him. When he looked at himself in the mirror, it was as if he was looking at a stranger, someone who had died in that forest and been replaced by something else. His face was hollow, his eyes haunted. He hadn't just lost time, he had lost himself. But the worst part was the whispers. They followed him, quiet at first, but always there, curling around the edges of his mind, creeping into his thoughts when he least expected it. The voice, that same voice that had called to him from the forest, now lingered in the quiet moments, soft and insistent. "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed, a constant reminder of the terror he had faced, of the price he had paid for curiosity. Mark tried to push it away, to move on, but every night, when he closed his eyes, the darkness would return. He would hear the rustling of the trees, feel the cold breath on his neck, and see those empty eyes, those hollow, soulless eyes, staring at him from the shadows. He knew they were there, just beyond the veil of his consciousness, watching, waiting, as if the forest had never truly let him go. And one night, just as he thought he might finally find some peace, the phone rang. His hand trembled as he reached for it, an irrational fear gripping him. He picked it up, heart hammering in his chest. There was no voice on the other end, just silence. Then a whisper. It was faint at first, but Mark could hear it clearly, unmistakably. "You shouldn't have come." He slammed the phone down, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He knew now, knew with a deep, soul-shattering certainty, that he was never going to escape. The forest had not just claimed his body, it had taken something much worse. It had taken his soul, and it would follow him until the end of his days. The darkness would never leave him. It was inside him now, a part of him, as much a part of him as the breath in his lungs. The forest had marked him, and its terror would continue to echo through every moment of his life, every shadow in the corner of his eyes, every whisper in the night. Mark had been lost to the forest, and nothing, not time, not distance, could undo what had been done. He was never truly alone, not anymore. The forest was still there, waiting, watching. And one day it would call him back. And when it did, he would answer. There was no escaping the call of the lost.